All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of the 2021 Smart Start Conference. We're so excited that you can be here with us. While we're virtual, it's so good to connect with all of you and continue to learn together. This morning, I wanted to remind you all to please mute your microphones so that we can hear the presenter well throughout the session. But if you have questions or clarifications, please feel free to put them in the chat. And I also wanted to give a reminder that these sessions will be recorded and will be available after the conference for a limited period of time for you to review. And now I am pleased to introduce our presenter for today, Scottie Seawell, who is going to talk to us about creating your future with your community. So thank you, Scottie, for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for being here and welcoming me and everyone and providing tech support. As we all know, it's quite an adventure these days, going to conferences and hoping that the technology is going to work well. I have to say I've been pleased in some of the sessions that I've attended for this conference, how smoothly it has worked. So it's been a pleasure so far attending, and I am so thankful to see so many friends and folks that I've worked with in the past popping up in the participants list. So very glad to be here. As Sarah said, I'm Scottie Seawell. I have my own consulting firm, Leading and Governing Associates, and I work primarily with nonprofit organizations, although I also have worked with boards of education across the state of North Carolina and some in Colorado. And in particular, on the framework I'm going to share today, have worked with them to help them engage in other ways with their communities. So we're going to give it another minute or two to let folks get in, and then I'm going to start sharing my screen. While we're waiting for that, if everybody would hover over their picture, their screen, and click on the 3 little dots and make sure that you're named the way that you would like to be, for me to recognize you as. We will be hopefully very engaged and interactive during this session. I've presented it before in person at Smart Start conferences, and it's a lot of fun because everybody's up and moving around the room together, doing an exercise called Where We Stand. Today, we're gonna try multiple ways of helping everybody be engaged, one being Jamboard, but it's very helpful to me and to everybody else if you can make sure that you have your name as you like to be recognized as. But don't worry, if you don't want to be called on, I will not be calling you out in any kind of way. So again, if you can hover over your picture where there are the 3 dots and then scroll down, usually towards the bottom of the drop-down menu where it says rename, and then rename yourself, your first name, last name, that would be great. Organization that you're with is also good too. Preferred pronouns are awesome as well. All right. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. I have some slides I'm going to present. This one. I love it when I can see both my screen and you all as participants and the slides that I'm sharing. So I hope everyone can see my slides. Welcome. This session is titled Creating Your Future with Your Community, starting with who and why. And as by way of introductions, I hope you all can do as we were discussing before, is hover over your picture and the 3 dots and rename yourself, first and last name, and your organization. That way I know who's here and you all know who's here with you as well. Welcome. I'm so excited to be with you. So the key concepts that we're going to cover in this session, where I'm going to be introducing a public values framework to help you think about the people in your community, the systems in your community, the values that are implicit in being, in particular, somebody who is an American, who is in and living in the United States of America, because this is a way of thinking about and engaging with people that hopefully bridges divides and builds relationships and understanding and trust. I hope you were at the opening session with Susan Gale Perry, where she talked about things that we're learning, lessons that we're learning in particular from the pandemic that we're in, the economic impact that that has had, particularly with regards to you all around early childhood care and education, and the racial injustice that our nation is reckoning with in a more intentional and heightened way at this time, that we need to be able to build relationships and trust. We need to earn trust in the way that we do the things that we do and implement the programs that we implement. We need to engage more deeply and more broadly across our communities in this work, and find ways to collaborate more and make integrated decisions rather than how we've been more likely to do in our culture in competitive ways and in ways of feeling like we needed to win the day or win the grant or win the contract. We need to start thinking in different ways if we want to solve problems effectively and make decisions that include the largest number of people in our community towards the vision that we have for our community. So this is a framework and that can help, I think, do that. And I've used it particularly working with public boards of education in North Carolina around envisioning the future of public education in their county and in their community. And it has always been an effort to broadly include stakeholders within their communities, including the Smart Start partnerships, or other childcare, early childcare organizations, resource and referral agencies, as well as all the members of their community in a way that helps envision the future, in this case for public education. But I would say that it's also possible to do so as a Smart Start partnership or other collective action and advocacy efforts. So success starts with who to include. And I encourage organizations and people on these collaborative types of efforts to include broadly, to think deeply about the people in their communities that need to be engaged if you are to actually create the future, that you need to envision it together. And even those folks that sometimes may seem to complain a lot or have a different perspective or be critical of the work that you're doing, they need to be included as well. We need to learn how to build the relationships with folks that think differently from us sometimes and try and understand and help them to understand where we're coming from and find a way to be on the same page together. So you need to think about who to include up front. You also need to think about the big why, and that to me is the vision. There was a TED Talk done 10, 11 years ago now, I believe, by a man named Simon Sinek, who has written a book on starting with why. And starting with why means that we're starting with the bigger, fuzzier picture that we're trying to create. And so you want to work with people to define what that vision is, what that why is, why you exist, what is the purpose of this effort, why should it happen, why do we want to engage with each other in this way. And so again, the framework that I'm going to be sharing will help you understand how to include others and develop this why, this sense of the future that you want to work towards together on. This is also an opportunity to understand yourself. So we're going to engage in an activity using Jamboard, and then perhaps also, given that we have a good number of folks on this session, the reaction emojis that you have in Zoom on your screen. And it's called Where Do You Stand? So I'll explain more about that in a minute, but it's an opportunity to understand yourself first. And then understand the role of public values in public decision-making and envisioning around public problems and public issues. And then we're going to do this exercise again, but think about others and how they might answer some same questions and how that might be differently from the way that we answered that. And again, it's this framework and exercise around where do you stand and public values. So those are the key takeaways that I hope we're going to cover and that you will have as a part of this session. Before we get started, I'm going to put the link to the Jamboard in the chat. I also encourage you to put questions in the chat, and you can respond through the chat, or if this sparks some idea or resource that you want to share with this group, please also put the link to that in the chat. Sarah and Ren and Jonathan are going to be keeping an eye on the chat and can make sure that I answer any questions that you might put in there. I'm also open to you coming off mute and asking questions and participating in that way too. And I'm sure to have some questions from time to time and welcome folks engaging with all of us throughout this process. Okay, so this next, close the chat. What we're about to do is called Where Do You Stand? I'm going to put in the chat Google Jamboard link, hopefully. Although maybe not, let's see. I'm gonna also share that part of the screen too. This is where the technology gets exciting. And for some reason, Ren, it's not letting me paste into chat. I'm not really sure why. Let's see what happens here.
Is there another way you could send it so we could put it in the chat?
Yeah, let's see. Do you want to send me your, or put in your chat the best email address or way to send that to you?
Just sent you an email address.
Thank you. Apologies all for this slight delay. Let's see if it. So try my Gmail email address, which is put that in here for you, Sarah. Maybe that'll come more quickly. And if that doesn't work out, then we're going to go with the reactions and hopefully be able to see each other that way. Oh, there it is. Thank you, Sarah. All right, so I just sent the link for the Jamboard to Sarah. While we're waiting for that to get in for you all to follow, if some of you have trouble or prefer not to move on over to Jamboard, I am going to share my screen with the Jamboard so that you can watch from there. And I also encourage you to use the reactions that you have available to you to sort of answer these questions too. Yeah, and thank you for the suggestions on copying and pasting. It still is not letting me do it, but now Sarah has put it into the chat. So if you can click on the link that she sent to everyone that says Jamboard, I will start sharing that part of my screen too. All right, so for those of you who are coming over to Jamboard, if you will go over here to where it says sticky note and get yourself a sticky note and type your name. You see how I have my name on the sticky note? It's been moved over here. I'm hiding the number 4 right now. So if you would get your sticky note and then move it away from everybody else. And can the folks who are on the screen see the Jamboard right now as it's being shared?
We can.
Great. And can you also see the slides where it says
overlap.
Great. Okay. You guys are doing great. And this is going to be a little crazy because we have so many people, which I love, on the Jamboard. But you'll see on the Jamboard that I put numbers. There's a 1, a number 2. Oops, somebody moved this to another page. All right, I'm not sure where we all went. Did somebody clear the page? Sorry, folks. This may be why this is a little crazy. So Sarah and I were talking at the start of the session about how our students have gotten really good at Jamboard. So as you will see, we just all got cleared. So you're going to need to go get another sticky note, as am I.
So I think the Jamboard is actually full right now. People are getting messages that too many people are using it. So if you can't get in, then we will use the reactions on the Zoom to help you participate. And maybe we can cycle in and out at different points.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to get started. Do not click on clear frame though. Come over here, if you are in there, to the Jamboard and get a sticky note. And I'm gonna put back in here the numbers that I had. All right, so great job on getting into Jamboard all. You're learning this new tool if you've never used it before, and I'm learning more about it myself. So make sure you find your sticky note. Sometimes we get stuck on top of each other as sticky notes. And I'm going to ask you to move around the Jamboard, move your sticky note around the Jamboard based on how you want to answer a series of questions that I'm about to pose, okay? So here's the slide for the questions. And the first question is, allow, limit, or ban the sale of soda, snacks, and fast food in public schools. So if it was your decision, I want you to go to the number 1 if you would allow the sale of soda, snacks, and fast food in your public school. So in other words, move your sticky note over to the 1, which is on this far side over here. Move to the number 2, which is up here at the top of the Jamboard, if you wanted to limit the sale of soda and snacks and fast food in public schools. And move over here to the number 3, if you would like to ban them altogether. No soda, snacks, or fast food in public schools. So 1 over here is to allow, 2 is to limit in some way, and 3 is to outright ban, okay? Move your sticky note accordingly. You guys are doing an awesome job on this. Thank you. All right, so I want you just to look around. It looks to me like there are a lot of folks on the limit up there with the number 2. We have a couple folks over on the 1, which would be to allow. And we have a few folks clustered closer to the number 3, which would be to ban altogether. So just want you to take note of that, all right? And think about, why you are standing where you are. Why are you near number 2 or number 1 or 3? Okay. And it's okay to be the only one standing over there in 1, because in our communities, we often have somebody who feels differently about it. All right. So now the next question. So I just want you to look and observe on that one. The next question that I want you to think about has a 4-part answer. So now we have a number 1, a number 2, a number 3, and a number 4. With regards to pre-K education, something I'm sure a lot of you know a lot about. Move yourself to number 1 if you believe it should be public, universal, and voluntary in terms of sending children to pre-K education. Move to the number 2 if you feel it should be public, universal, and mandatory. Move to the number 3 if you feel it should be public, universal, and mandatory only for at-risk children. And move to the number 4 if you feel it should be a private responsibility left up to their parents and guardians. So 1 is public, universal, and voluntary. 2 is public, universal, and mandatory. 3 is public, universal, and mandatory only for at-risk children. And 4 is a private responsibility left up to the parents and guardians. All right, so we have lots of folks, it looks like, over near number 1, public, universal, and voluntary. We have a couple folks closer to number 2 in terms of mandatory. I'm all alone down at 4, private responsibility left up to their parents and guardians. That's mostly because I was covering up the number 4 on our previous question when we didn't have 3 choices. And again, does anybody want to come off mute and say, why they chose to be closer to number 1 than say number 4 or 3? Linda, would you like to share?
Sure. I don't feel like it should be mandatory, because I think that that's a family dynamic, and I think we would be impinging on their own beliefs and values. But I do think that it should be universal, because I believe that that would help put the support systems in place so that our young people can have multiple support systems to be prepared to get the skills they need later in life.
Great, thank you for sharing. Others, anybody else want to share why they're standing near a particular number 1, or there seem to be a few of you at 2 in terms of public, universal, and mandatory?
Hi, I'm Leonor, and I think it should be public, universal, and in the same way mandatory. But when I say mandatory, is give us the numbers, the rooms, the slots for the kids, because that's why we got limited slots in our counties. So that put the spot, so we left many people on the waiting list.
Right, so there's more demand even now than there are capacity to provide pre-K.
And it's amazing the number of the children that benefit from this program. It is, you see the blooming in the children when they enter this program.
Right, yeah, thank you for sharing, absolutely. So the next question that you're going to move around the Jamboard on, so I'm going to go back to here, is to move to number 1 on the Jamboard if you want to allow, move to number 2 if you want to limit, and move to number 3 if you want to ban single-use plastics such as straws, grocery bags, food, wraps, and water bottles. So 1 is allow their use, 2 is to limit their use, and 3 is to ban their use. And several years ago in North Carolina along the coast, there was a big effort to ban them. And in some states now, if you travel to some states, you can no longer get free plastic bags when you go to the grocery store. You would have to pay for them. And they're trying to encourage people not to use single-use plastic bags, but instead to limit them, though they haven't always outright banned them. All right, so it looks like we have a number of folks a little bit more spread out this time. So would anybody who is on the limit at number 2 like to share why you picked limiting the use of single-use plastics? And just to be clear, these are, this is what you feel is best, and that's okay. There are not any wrong or right either or examples or choices that you can make. There's lots of good reasons, things that you value, concerns that you might have, or opportunities that you want to be able to use. And so again, in these questions, it's not that any one of you has the right answer or is making the right choice. These are all choices that we can make.
It's Pamela. So I just traveled this weekend to Bald Head Island, and in the context of traveling, it is very hard to limit or to ban completely. When you are going certain places, you may or may not have everything that you need when you go out. When you're home, you may actually have access to those things that you would use and not do that. But when you're traveling, it's really hard to keep track of all that kind of stuff, pack that kind of stuff. So it does create for me, an issue with banning it completely, but I do appreciate the concept.
Right. So, I mean, there's trade-offs, right? And that's another point. These decisions that we make and think about and involve people in have trade-offs, and different people need to make different decisions based on circumstances. As Pamela shared, traveling right now, we require the use of plastics in a lot of respects, and we have to if we're going to take things with us on our trip. So Pamela, you were near number 2, is that correct, around limit?
Yes.
Yeah. Somebody who's on ban, so somebody who moved their sticky over to number 3, outright ban the use of plastics. Who would like to come off mute and share about that?
Scottie, this is Tony Kozar from Franklin Granville Being Smart Start.
Welcome,
I did not get my name up, but I would like to say, having been through the process of trying to cite landfills on 2 different occasions, I do see a need to try to keep this under control. But personally, I do fall more under number 2. But I can say that if you look at our roadways and with the efforts we're making to keep our roadsides clean, it does cause great concern. But ban is kind of where I would be from a historical standpoint in terms of trying to deal with waste and those things. But I do think it's a little bit unrealistic right now to ban completely.
Right, great. And thank you for sharing those different points of view, because when we're trying to do something like cite a landfill, or we're trying to keep our roadways clean, or we're trying to figure out how we should solve a particular problem, we need to take all of those different points of view into consideration. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So thanks for sharing, Tony. Anybody else want to say a reason why you chose to stand where you're standing with regards to single-use plastics?
Hi, I would add that research has shown that each one of us in our blood system has the equivalent of a credit card worth of plastic in our body. And that goes back to the food chain, because there's so many single-use plastics that are degrading in the oceans and the waterways. So it just keeps getting worse. It's a really difficult issue though.
It's a very difficult issue. Absolutely right. Thanks for sharing, Jennifer. And it's a health issue, right? So there's the use of land, as Tony was talking about. There's the environmental pollution aspects that also has to do with communities and community well-being. And then there's individual personal health concerns that you're expressing. And then, as Pamela pointed out, there's this, convenience and also current expectations for how we will be able to use plastics, particularly if you're traveling. I have not flown since the pandemic, but we used to have to put everything, if you wanted to take it in your carry-on that was liquid, in certain size bottles in a Ziploc plastic bag, right? So it is complicated and it is confusing, and there needs to be a lot of, again, engagement if we are going to come to some kind of agreement and trust and use data well to help us solve some of these problems. All right, so next, this one is more relevant to the past year or so. And so if you could choose one of these to prevent possible COVID infection, would you choose to wear a mask? If so, go to number 1. Would you choose social distance? If so, go to the number 2 on the Jamboard. And if you want to get vaccinated, go stand near or move your sticky to the number 3. So you can only choose one. Which would you choose to prevent possible infection? Wear a mask, social distance, or get vaccinated? All right. You guys are jamming on the Jamboard really well. Thank you. Moving around. All right, so again, you can only choose one under this scenario that I'm creating. Would you choose a mask, social distance, or get vaccinated? Who would like to come off mute and sort of share why you chose the one that you chose? And folks, again, remember, listen to what folks say. Yes, Claudette. Claudette, are you? I can't hear you. Did you? I'm not sure. I'm not seeing you on the Jamboard. I'm having trouble.
This is Debbie Harrell from Smart Start in Hanover County.
Hey, Debbie.
I chose vaccination because in order to get herd immunity, I believe in the science that that's the only way that we're going to ever get that herd immunity, that we've got to get 80% vaccination. So I believe in that. So I chose that.
Yeah. Right. So, you chose number 3 to get vaccinated, and thanks for sharing about that. And again, you're expressing, this vision of the future around herd immunity. And to get to herd immunity, certain things have to happen, in particular, the rate of vaccination. So that's a value that you're expressing around community in particular. So folks who picked either social distance or wear a mask, I'd love to hear from one of you about why you made that choice.
Well, this is Linda. I have been vaccinated, but I did choose number 1 if I had a choice. If that's all that it would take to prevent it, that would be the least costly, it would be the least invasive. But I mean, I have been vaccinated. But having to pick, if I knew only had to do one and that would do it, that's the one I picked, because I feel like that would help with the common cold. That would help with so many other things that we transmit. It also helps during allergy season and mowing the grass. And so I just basically picked that, although I have been vaccinated. And because I do work with children and I want to continue to be around them. And so I made that choice. But since we had different areas here, that's why I picked one. If that could do it,
no,
man,
thanks
that
for
would be easy.
sharing. Right, thanks for sharing. And again, this is sort of to help illustrate a point I'm going to go into now. So I appreciate you sharing that. And right now, children cannot be vaccinated, so they wouldn't have this choice. And so we might, as adults, choose differently for ourselves as well. Somebody who spoke or moved their sticky to number 2 around you would choose social distance, like to share? See a few folks up there. I did hear a statistic early on in the pandemic that said, if you want to be sure not to get COVID, don't get around anybody else. Social distance 100%, and you'll be all right. Yeah, Cheryl. Would you like to share? I think it just came off mute. All right, we have one last question for this round of Where You Stand. And it's to allow, limit, or ban the use of electric scooters on public sidewalks and roadways. So if you had the power to decide, what would you do? Move to number 1 if you would allow the use of electric scooters on public sidewalks and roadways. Move to number 2 if you want to limit, then move to number 3 if you wanted to outright ban the use of electric scooters on public sidewalks and roadways. So number 1 is allow, number 2 is limit at the top of the Jamboard, and number 3 is ban. All right, so folks are moving around, so that means that we don't always make the same decisions depending on what the decision is or the policy is. Allow, limit, or ban. Somebody who's over near number 3, ban the use of electric scooters on public sidewalks and roadways. Who would like to share while you're over there? Now, if we were in the conference session together, I would be walking around with a microphone and you could expect me to come up and say, so why are you standing here? Linda, you just moved. Do you want to share why you moved? Linda, yellow sticky Linda. Or there's a Debbie over near number 3 to ban.
This is Linda Heinman, Linda
Hi.
H. I chose 3 because I have personally experienced neighborhood children with the electronic scooters on the sidewalks and do cause harm for the older community members who are trying to walk on the sidewalks. As a driver, it's also difficult for me at times to maneuver around those on electric devices.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Linda, for coming off mute and sharing with us. I appreciate it. Right, so, it is a bit dicey if you're a pedestrian on a sidewalk or you're a driver in a car to maneuver, to share these roadways and sidewalks with people on electric scooters. Somebody who is over near number 1, there's a few of you that were allow electric scooters on public sidewalks and roadways. I'd welcome hearing from one of you about, thoughts on allowing. We've seen in college towns, I live in a college town and have visited other college towns in the last several years before the pandemic, and scooters were all the rage in terms of how to get around, so much so that they were even the public use or you could rent them and leave them somewhere else after you had gotten across campus or across town on one. why might someone want to allow them, or why might a university or city government want to allow them their use? Wilma or Ivy, or maybe Paula, would you like to come off mute and talk about why you're closer to number one?
Hi, Scottie. This is Wilma. Can you hear me?
I can. Thanks, Wilma.
Okay.
How are you?
I'm good. So I just said allow because I think it's an accessibility thing. It allows people to get different places that might not normally have a different way of transportation. It has more freedom than other forms of public transportation in terms of scheduling or waiting for a bus or the subway. And it's also an easy way for cities to make revenue to put towards infrastructure.
Great, right. So lots of good reasons to allow as well. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate it. All right, so what is this all about? I'm gonna move now mainly to sharing the slides again. So if everybody wants to keep your sticky note and Jamboard, we're going to do a quick round of this again. But at the moment, I hope you can see the screen with the slide that says, what are these choices about, right? And why do they arise in the context of creating your community's future? And the little cartoon says, I hear it lacks dialogue. So that has something to do with this in terms of creating futures and including people. It needs to be in the conversation. We need to be able to talk about these things. So as a quick overview, we're going to really dig into three things. We're going to talk about public values framing as a way of talking and having these types of conversations with folks that hopefully build relationships and build trust and build the ability to create and work towards our future together, and less about how these types of decisions divide us, but more about how is it bringing us together. So I've done visioning and then strategic framing and planning and implementing and navigating, particularly around these public values with public school boards and districts. And the first thing we start about is the who we're going to include. And we try, as I said earlier, to be broadly representative. We want folks from all different walks of their community engaged in this work, because we're going to need all the people across the community to understand and support and implement and work together to create the future of public education, in that case, in their communities. And so we start with the who, and then we start with creating a vision and getting to know each other as we create that vision. And one of the ways that I've helped communities get to know each other is by doing this where you stand exercise with all the community stakeholders that are involved in this process, so that they can see sometimes we think the same and sometimes we think differently, but we are all in this community together. And it's important that we include and make space and room for each other as we envision the future and then work towards it collaboratively. So we start with the who and the why, and then we go to the what and the how. And the reason that that's really important is because an idea about how we should do things, like, we must ban all electric scooters from sidewalks, will kill a good idea this quick, right? Around, we want to have electric scooters because it's more efficient, it's more environmentally friendly. But on the other hand, it might cause some problems in terms of pedestrians and people on scooters and people in cars being able to navigate together in a community. So we really have to start with what is the big picture, not the how we're going to do something, not how we solve the problem before we understand the problem, before we decide the future that we want to work towards together. After we've decided that and we've involved broadly and deeply in our community people in deciding that, then we can move to the planning and the navigating around the what and the how. So that's really what this framework is designed to help people have those types of conversations. And so the values of the public good are really four big bucket values of American life, culture, our country. And they're the values of liberty, equality, community, and prosperity. And the value of liberty, and again, all of us have these values because we are Americans, but we weight them differently and they're in tension with each other. But the value of liberty is really the value of the I, you know, the individual, freedom, choice. The value of equality is the value of groups. How are we valuing and weighting equally or doing things equitably around different groups in our communities and in our society? The value of community is about we and we the people. And the value of prosperity, another big bucket value, is the value of the market. So these are the four big bucket values, public values in American life and in our communities. And so when you are talking to somebody or people are making choices or thinking about how to solve a problem or create the future that they envision for their community, you'll hear them use certain words when they're talking about these big bucket values, these public values. And when they're talking about liberty, you'll hear words like freedom and choice and independence and self-help and self-governing. You'll hear things like personal responsibility and self-determination, transparency, rights, opportunity, individuality. And I would pose that all of us in some situations, this is our first value, our primary value. And again, these values are in tension with each other, but they all exist. And most issues, problems, public decisions that need to be made involve all four of these values. And so we need to consider all four of them when we're envisioning the future, when we're creating our community's future, because if we don't, it's going to cause us more trouble as we navigate, as we implement, as we try and do the hard work of creating that future. So the first big bucket value is the value of liberty. Like I said, the value of the I. The second big bucket value is equality. And that you'll hear people express preferences for equality when they're talking about fairness and justice and equity and acceptance and diversity and inclusion, equal treatment, leveling the playing field. And as I said at the beginning, we're really in a time right now where we are rebalancing the primary values in terms of how we look at public policy and public decision making. And there's now a pull towards greater understanding of equality and equity and diversity and inclusion in our society. The next big bucket value is community. And again, that's the value of the we, the people. And it is often expressed when folks are talking about safety and security and a sense of place and belonging. When we want things to be attractive and appealing, and we want our communities to, value the culture and the history and the sacredness of our spaces. It's around collective action. It's around social and moral order, and it's around the quality of life, right? When folks are expressing the value of prosperity, they will talk about things like economy and efficiency and measurements and return on investment and the quantity of life and the standard of living and privatization and commercialization. And these values work together as well. So you'll have liberty and prosperity sometimes working together when you hear folks express things like the free market, right? So you have an expression of liberty and an expression of prosperity together. Likewise, you can have issues and problems and visions of the future. And I would argue that if you're going to envision the future of something, you need to think about how all of these values are expressed, where all four need to be considered in terms of bringing people together and creating your community's future. So you all have access to these slides, and I refer to this slide as the answer sheet. If you keep this with you when you're trying to have a meeting about citing a landfill, Tony, or deciding whether to make pre-K education mandatory or voluntary or universal, or a decision best left to the parents and guardians. Think about what's being expressed when people have those preferences, when they say things like that. What value are they expressing? And realize that that's something you value as well, but maybe differently in different circumstances, and in different public policy decision-making or decision-makings that the board might be making. So these values frame our visions for caring and educating our children. And I want to do another quick Jamboard, but this time I want everybody to take 15 seconds and think of somebody that you often disagree with, somebody who you'll be having conversations about some of the issues that we were just moving around the Jamboard to answer, and they would answer differently from you. And this time I want you to move your sticky based on how that person would answer these same questions, okay? So the first one, as it was the last time, is allow, limit, or ban the sale of soda, snacks, and fast food in public schools. So if you believe that this person that you often disagree with would want to allow, or would want to limit, or would want to ban, move your sticky to where you think they would go, all right? And then if somebody would come off mute and let us know, is that a different place from where you would be in this situation? If you were deciding about soda, snacks, and fast food in public schools? So over near number 1 on the far left side is allow, up top around the number 2 is limit, and move your sticky over to number 3 if it's ban. Allow, limit, or ban. All right, so who's moved to say allow, because the person that you are thinking of that you often don't agree with would want to allow soda, snacks, and fast food? Pamela.
Scottie, I have to tell you, I lived this. And so as chair of the New Hanover County School Health Advisory Board, I had to go up against the superintendent on this issue. And we wanted a full ban all the way up through high school. And what we got was a no, because they had a contract with Coca-Cola for the sports stuff. And the problem was that by going forward the way he went forward, there was a county north of us that got fined because soda machines were left on past the hours they were allowed to be on, and the fine was significant.
Wow.
And I walked straight back into his office and said, you don't have a choice, because if we get fined, it will be much larger. We're a much larger county. So in effect, we negotiated this particular topic. And so I originally was over on the ban side, because as somebody who is a public health educator, these habits that we allow children to move forward and make accessible through schools creates health issues longitudinally for children and families, and they just don't know it yet. And I know it because I live it. And so I just think it's really important that we control these kinds of issues. We were the first county in the state when I was living in New Hanover to ban fried French fries in schools. And it was an uproar, but they were baked and nobody really knew the difference once we started baking them, you know?
Right.
So anyway, so that's where I landed, but I put myself at 2 because I had to negotiate. And it started with, we wanted the ban, but we negotiated a limit. And when we negotiated the limit, we still had a problem. And so ultimately, you know, I don't know where it stands now. I would imagine it's limit, not ban. But anyway, that's where I stood.
Right. And so I hope everyone, thanks so much, Pamela, for sharing, could hear some of the different values being expressed in that, that example. There was the issue around healthy foods and the health and concerns about obesity in children. And there was the economic concerns, having a contract to have vending machines to sell Coke products that the school system had. And then, being fined is a different form of economic prosperity value concern. And I'm sure the school system was getting much needed revenue by having that contract with Coca-Cola in that example. And then there's, there's no straight line, right? And there's no one way for one person in our democracy to say outright ban, and there's reasons why, I believe in our system of representative democracy where we do have to work through these things. We do have to talk through and figure out what is the right way or right decision to make at this time in this place, given our community. And it's also why it's so important to involve people in these conversations, even though sometimes it feels frustrating or, we have a different personal preference of what the solution should be. We need to make sure that it's going to be implementable, that we're all going to be able to work towards it together. So sometimes, it's not point A to point B. We need to travel through all four of these values. We need to consider all four of these big public values, and we need to make sure we're including all of the folks who are going to be impacted as best we can so that we can get there together and create our future together. So great example, Pamela. Thanks so much for sharing. Look at kind of where everybody is. Think about whether you're in a different place, and then let's consider our NC pre-K, or sorry, I keep saying NC pre-K because I'm in North Carolina, but pre-K education. Move to number 1, how the person that you sometimes or often disagree with would answer this. To 1, if they believe in public, universal, and voluntary pre-K education. To number 2, if that person believes in public, universal, and mandatory. If they're likely to believe public, universal, and mandatory only for at-risk children. To number 3, or if they're likely to believe it's a private responsibility left up to parents and guardians. Move down to number 4 on the Jamboard. All right, there's definitely been some movement on our Jamboard. Who would like to speak to being in a different place from where you were when you answered this question, and why you think the person you sometimes disagree with is in a different place from you on this question? Feel free to come off mute and share. And remember, this is somebody else, it's not you. So why do you think they would answer this question differently? We got anybody who is on number 4 who would like to share? The private responsibility left up to their parents and guardians. Jane or Kelly S. or Jennifer M.
I'll share. So the person I know, I think thinks that families should make those decisions on their own. I think that sometimes it's interpretation, or the person in particular does not have any early childhood experience or degree. And I think about it, most of the topics that we've talked about has to do sometimes with the research too, that sometimes people are just not educated on the topic. And so they don't really know why you would pick universal pre-K or why you would do these certain things. I think about family structures, and when we talk about family engagement and involvement, that not all families are the same. So an upper class family that had the funding to be able to pick a high quality preschool program would probably not have the same opinion of someone who didn't have the same resources, funding, and so they would look at it differently.
Right, right. There can be lots of reasons why people make the choices that they make or would prefer to have, you know, options or choices, or would, you know, appreciate the importance of pre-K education. And so again, it's really important to sometimes not jump to conclusions or assume why somebody is making the choice that they're making, but to step back and really, you know, have conversations and get to know the person and find out, you know, where do we have some common ground, or where's an opportunity to share our experiences or our points of view in a way that builds relationships and hopefully builds understanding for how we can work together and move forward together. So thanks, Kelly, for sharing on that one. And again, this time, the Jamboard, it's much more spread out around these 4 choices than it was the first time. We answered it based on how we would answer these questions. So I appreciate everybody kind of reflecting and thinking about those folks that sometimes we struggle with, and trying to think through, you know, why is this important to them? And again, it often is because there is a different value preference being expressed, but one that we can appreciate, even though it's not the value preference that we would express in a particular situation. All right. Next one was the single-use plastic. So this person that you sometimes or often disagree with, where would they move in terms of the use of single-use plastics? Would they stand with allow? Would they be limit, or would they ban the use of single-use plastics? Number 1 is allow, move to number 2 if it's limit, or number 3 if it's ban. Only 3 choices this time for where to stand. And this the person you often disagree with. We're just going to kind of look around for a minute and see that folks have moved. And again, we're a little bit more spread out than we might have been the first time. And so that we can move forward, I'm just going to leave that one there and go to the one with regards to preventing possible infection. How would your person, or how has your person that you sometimes disagree with, chosen to prevent infection? 1, wear a mask. 2, social distance. Or 3, get vaccinated. If you can only choose one, if your friend could only choose one, which would they choose? Wear a mask, social distance, get vaccinated. Ivy got moved out. I'm gonna move Ivy down here. And would somebody else like to come off mute and share why your person that you sometimes disagree with would choose what they would, the one choice they would have around masks or social distance or getting vaccinated to prevent infection?
Hi, this is Ivy.
Hi, Ivy. Thank you.
Hi. So as you can see, I left mine down at the bottom. The person that I have in mind, they don't agree with any of these. So I've just put them down there.
Great.
Yeah. So.
And that happens, doesn't it?
It
right?
does. It does. Yes.
Now, look, you've got people joining you now that you've said,
Yeah.
wait, we have other choices?
Yeah,
the choice is to not choose,
not in there.
to not participate.
Nope, it's not in their range of scope. So they're just a hard no on all of it. So,
yeah. And why do you think that is?
You know, I've asked and I've never understood the answer. So
What have
I
they
can't-
said when they answered?
It's usually that honestly the answer is they don't want to be honest. That's the main answer I get, and just that they believe in what's called the herd immunity. I don't know what that is. I have no idea. But that's usually what they say. We'll get over it with herd immunity is what I hear. So that's the reasoning I get.
Yeah, and it sounds to me like by herd immunity, they mean everybody will get it, and so they don't need to do these other things. That we got to get there, and this is the way we're going to get there.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's a little bit of making a choice for yourself, right?
Yep.
But it's also an expression of a different way of dealing with this pandemic in terms of community, right? But it's different from the way, Linda, I think you were expressing earlier, getting vaccinated to help us get to herd immunity, right? So there's different ways of making choices, but towards the same future, hopefully, if that was something. So how do you take those competing hows into consideration if the vision were to be, we want to reach herd immunity? There isn't necessarily a right answer because this is different values being expressed around a common future. Tony, yes.
I just think the people who would disagree with me, they see any of this as infringing on some great right that they have to pretty much do as they feel like they need to do, to have personal responsibility, and they just don't buy any of it. So they kind of, in terms of ignoring all the facts and the data that's around, and until, in some of these cases, until this virus hit home, they held to that position. They really did, until a close family member was stricken, and then they shifted. But until that time, they were not able to be moved.
Right. Well, and thank you for sharing that. So a couple of thoughts in that regard. One, the experiences that we have, the people that we get to know, the relationships that we have are a way that often we can change our perspective, right? So Tony, you were saying they really didn't want to do any of this or buy into any of this until it hit home, right? Till they had a personal experience with somebody having it, or they had it themselves. So that's one thing I just want to put out there. And why it's so important to have conversations with people. Reserve judgment, try and understand where they're coming from. What is it that they're valuing? Yes, sometimes, folks just, seem stubborn, but I would, as you said, some folks, it's personal responsibility, it's my choice. They are preferencing a value for liberty and independence and personal responsibility. And some would say, in contrast to understanding values around community and community health and public well-being. And so we need to think about, how do we help those two different points of view, those two different value preferences work together, get to know each other, have a conversation. What do we have in common? Is there a way for us to come together and exist in our community together in that way? It's not easy, and I never once want anybody to think it's easy, but I do hope that this framework can kind of help us think differently and make space for these types of conversations and reflections and building of relationships. All right, and so last but not least, move to where you think this person that you often disagree with would be with regards to electric scooters. So again, over near number 1, if allow, number 2, if limit, or number 3, if they should ban the use of electric scooters on public sidewalks and roadways. And I emphasize public because that's really what we're talking about, is when we're in public, we're in community together. It's less of a concern if you're riding your scooter on your, your land. But if you're out in public on your scooter, that's a different situation because you're coming into contact with others in your community. So again, I'll just leave this here for everybody to look at, but it looks like folks have moved again from how you answered it initially when you were answering for yourself. And sometimes we don't, it can be, we disagree in certain circumstances, but we don't disagree in others. And that's an important piece to recognize as well. And that folks can change. So, continuing relationships and continuing conversations is important to creating the future of your community. So when creating the future, I want everybody to reflect for a minute. Why might you want to broadly engage and include your community stakeholders? We're going to leave the Jamboard for now. Thank you all for participating. And if you weren't able to participate, thanks for watching. So who would like to share a reason for broadly engaging and including your community stakeholders when creating the future? In particular, with all of us in creating futures around early childhood care and education. Why would you want to broadly engage your community stakeholders?
This is Anna. I was going to say you want to do that because you can't have you have to open a conversation with dialogue to start this. In order to have a future, everyone needs to be included in the conversation and see what each person needs, each group needs. So it has to be a start of a conversation and an engagement.
Absolutely. And thanks so much for sharing. And I would posit that for too long, we have not included everybody, right? And when we don't include everybody and we don't think about all four of these big public values, we miss out on opportunities to create the future together and to be able to all enjoy life and make a living and live our lives in our communities together. Other reasons why you might want to broadly engage and include your community stakeholders in creating the future, in this case of early childhood care and education?
Norma,
Sure, Norma. Welcome.
It brings the community together so that they have a better understanding and appreciation for early childhood and care. And I think, unfortunately, because of COVID and many childcare centers having to close, schools having to close and reorganize in terms of hybrid, et cetera, that in itself has opened the eyes of our communities from a different perspective that they've never had before. They did not have the appreciation for the value of childcare if they didn't need it. But when they saw how it affected other people, their neighbors, their parents, or their children, and their ability to continue to function without that piece being an integral part of the community, it opened their eyes to a different thought and appreciation for that. If we had engaged them up front in the organization of our early childhood communities, et cetera, they may have had a better appreciation before that time.
Yes. And interestingly, I was participating in a collective impact action summit last week. And one of the presenters' presentations was around bridging the digital divide in Chattanooga public schools. And I encourage you to go online and Google Chattanooga public schools digital divide. One of the reasons they had, by their measures, no learning loss in their public school system is because they already had a collective action effort underway And they were able to bring the stakeholders who are already engaged together, already working on educational inequities together, to immediately get broadband to every family whose child or children were on free and reduced lunch. At no cost to those families. And they get this commitment for 10 years, they will have this access. And they've seen over this year of the pandemic, where there's been so much school from home and online, that it's been a benefit not only to the students to have all the things that they needed, but in particular access to broadband, to education, but it's also helped the families. Folks were talking about being able to get remote jobs because they had broadband, fiber even access. And so again, to your point, Norma, it was hugely important for them to have already had all these folks at the table in order to shift and be able to respond effectively to what happened in the pandemic. And they're the only place I've heard of that's had such a tremendous success in shifting when we all had to stay at home and learning had to happen online. That's not to say that it works, for elementary or early education situations, but it was an opportunity to bring a resource to folks in order to be able to try and continue to work, go to school, and manage during the pandemic. So thank you for pointing that out. So again, so when we talk about engaging and creating our future, we want to start with the who and why regarding stakeholder engagement. And broad engagement of stakeholders builds trust, support, and the understanding necessary for successful collaboration and eventual implementation. And this is a picture from about 10 years ago. I don't know if I have any folks from Alamance County and Alamance Burlington school system, but we did involve the Smart Start partnership in this effort too, to create a vision for public education in Alamance County. And these are some of the stakeholders. We included everybody. We had students, high school students, we had the head of United Way, we had municipal police officers, we had county commissioners, we had school board members, we had parents, all kinds of ways of trying to engage broadly within the community. And they did create a vision for public education that was then adopted by the Board of Education. And then they created the superintendent and leadership and the community strategic plan that involves, all the stakeholders in how to implement the strategic plan in support of the vision within the Alamance Burlington schools. So this is also a slide that's included in the materials that you can download. And this is really about strategic navigation. So once you've decided that you want to take on a collective public values decision-making effort or planning effort or future creation effort, there are really 5 steps to think through. And the first is to, what here says, identify the conflict. But I would also say, what is the vision of the future that you are wanting to work toward? So what values are represented? Which ones are not? What tensions and trade-offs do you see among these values? And represent the public. So again, starting with who's involved and whose values are represented more and whose values less, and are any values missing? Because we want to make sure we're taking them all into consideration. And then map a direction. Where do you want to go? Which value and values should have priority? And seek, as I said earlier, integrative solutions. Look beyond domination. Our culture in this country and system is much about competition. And that is really a weighting towards the market and towards the free market and towards liberty. And so really thinking about beyond domination, where winner takes all, we're competitive, we're the winners. Beyond that, and beyond compromise, where no one is fully satisfied because you're being asked to give up something that you value. really look for solutions that satisfy all the values to the greatest degree possible. And we call those integrative decisions, integrative solutions, integrative visioning. And then chart your course. Chart your course to implement your solution that best navigates all of the values involved. Remember that when dealing with the pull of multiple values, the shortest distance between where you are and where you want to go or where you're deciding to go may not be a straight line. You may need to do things that aren't always efficient, but they are more inclusive, right? We don't want to weight the fastest decision if it's going to exclude people that are part of our community and need to be valued and heard and represented as well. So I'm gonna go off sharing screen so that we can all be together, but I would welcome a conversation around challenges you can think of to successful strategic navigation in this way, and then maybe an opportunity or a strategy to counter. Stop sharing the screen. And move back to gallery view. So any questions you have about this, or opportunities you think where you might be able to use this public values framework, ideas that you have for helping you think about those folks in your community that maybe haven't been included and how to include more broadly and deeply. And I'm going to check the chat and just see what some of the comments there have been. It really is about, trying to bring different perspectives, different ownership. Tony, did you want to say something?
I was just thinking about how important it is not to be afraid to bring some people to the table. Sometimes, and we found this out when we celebrated our 20th year, there are people who are right in our community sometimes who just have a very surface understanding of what we do. We sometimes think they may know more, but engaging them allows us to be able to, number one, to educate them about what we're doing. And we also find that we create and find raving fans once they understand the totality of our work. So while there may be those who have a reputation for being somewhat difficult, I think engaging those people, they still have energy that they could use in a positive way for our work. So we can't assume that just because they might be controversial, as we might define them sometimes, that they don't have anything to bring to help us. So I found that this inclusive approach really works extremely well. For a quick example, we had a bank in our community who had heard of us, kind of knew about some of our work. But once we engaged them, they actually helped sponsor one of our fundraising events because they were sold on the work that we were doing. They just didn't quite understand it. They knew about it. So sometimes it's good to try to keep certain people and certain personalities over there and out of our circle. But there can be positives in bringing them in.
Absolutely. The easy path turns out not to be so easy, because you will, if you don't consider all the folks and you don't consider all the values, it will come back to you. Eventually you will have to deal with this. You will reckon with the being less inclusive. So I encourage you to include deeply and broadly, to reach out to folks in your community, and to realize also that there's a lot of people that might have some really good ideas. They just need to be asked. They need to be invited. They need to be told that, yes, we really do want to hear from you. and to make it possible for people to participate. It's hard sometimes for parents to participate. I know it's hard for providers to participate. So you have to think about, when are we meeting? You know, how do we facilitate this engagement in a way that is inclusive in all the ways that we need to include? So that's really all I have today and all I had time for. I'm so appreciative of all of you being here.